Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive proposed shift in American science and public health, straight from the blueprint of Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. But to really grasp his vision for a second scientific revolution, we actually have to look backward for a second at his personal history. Back in 2020, Dr. Bhattacharya co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, which questioned the efficacy of COVID lockdowns. Because of that, he was condemned as a quack and treated as a total pariah by the medical field. Our sources note that figures like Dr. Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins condemned the declaration as irresponsible and unethical, leading the charge against him. Bhattacharya says he endured severe censorship, with multiple government agencies actively playing a role in suppressing his point of view. He's called it a direct abuse of power by the federal government, specifically by Fauci and Collins, who used their funding power to essentially put their fingers on the scale. This even led to his own university opening a fact-finding investigation based on baseless charges, something he described as the most anxiety-inducing event of his professional life. But here's the wild part. Fast forward to today, and Bhattacharya went from being a pariah to President-elect Trump's confirmed nominee to lead the NIH. And his stance now? He actually forgives Fauci. He publicly stated that Fauci's pardon is a good thing, and he forgives the very people who nearly destroyed his career. He's not looking for revenge, he's looking forward, ready to take the helm of the NIH and fundamentally overhaul it.
So let's map out the exact structural problems he says are plaguing modern science and the specific policy fixes he's proposing. We'll be covering 5 key areas today. First, the life expectancy paradox. Second, the replication crisis. Third, scientific stagnation. Fourth, funding concentration. And finally, the revolution itself.
Section 1. The life expectancy paradox.
Let's start with a really glaring contradiction in American public health right now. It's the core reason Dr. Bhattacharya argues this mission is absolutely critical. On one hand, the NIH has this incredible historical legacy. I mean, it's the single largest public funder of biomedical research in the entire world. Its past investments gave us heart attack prevention, cancer treatments, and literal cures for terrible diseases like cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia. Huge wins, right? But on the other hand, despite those past victories and the massive amounts of money we're still pouring in, U.S. life expectancy has been stagnating since 2010. Just look at this graph. It brilliantly illustrates the paradox. While Sweden's life expectancy is on this steady upward climb, the U.S. line, it's faltering. It's dipping and falling further and further behind. We are pouring billions of dollars into medical research, yet our health outcomes are practically frozen in time. Dr. Bhattacharya points out that if this trend continues, our kids could literally live shorter, less healthy lives than we do. So this isn't just some political talking point. It represents a genuine cry for help from everyday Americans dealing with massive chronic disease problems. So how do we fix this stagnation? Well, Bhattacharya argues we have to return to a very foundational principle of the scientific method, epistemic humility. Basically, this is the essential recognition by a scientist that science is incredibly hard, and most of the ideas they hatch just aren't going to work, or simply aren't true. Remember his own history of being censored by a small group of health officials? He argues that whenever a tiny handful of people hold the power to dictate what is true or false in science, progress completely dies. True science means letting go of that absolute authority and actually embracing the humility to say, hey, I might be wrong.
Which brings us to Section 2, the replication crisis.
This is the first major structural problem facing the NIH today. Let's do a quick thought experiment. Are eggs good for us? If you were around in the 1970s and 80s, you probably remember eggs being treated like pure poison for your cholesterol. In the 90s, maybe you choked down an egg white omelet to be safe, but today, eggs are universally hailed as a superfood. So how on earth does the medical consensus flip-flop so dramatically? It happens because studies that we and even our doctors take for granted are published, blasted across the evening news, and then never actually replicated by other scientists. We just assume they're undeniable facts.
Here is the really crucial point. A peer-reviewed stamp on a research paper does not mean what most of us think it means. It doesn't mean a separate team of independent scientists went into a lab, double-checked all the data, and proved the study was absolutely true. No, it simply means a journal editor looked it over and gave it a thumbs up for publication. As Dr. Bhattacharya highlights, the only effective way for scientists to actually check one another is through replication, literally running the exact same experiment again to see if you get the same answer.
The structural solutions proposed for the NIH here are simple but super powerful. First, the NIH would actively pay scientists to replicate studies. Scientists shouldn't see replication as an attack. They need to welcome it as the literal engine of scientific advancement. Second, the NIH proposes adding a replication button to the hugely popular PubMed database. Right now, you can see if a paper was published or cited, but you have no clue if anyone actually proved it works. With this fix, anyone could click a button and instantly see if a scientific idea has actually held up to scrutiny. It's a total game changer.
Moving on to Section 3, Scientific Stagnation.
Now, what's really fascinating about this next issue is how it tackles the sheer lack of true disruptive innovation in modern labs. For every research dollar we spend today, we get far less scientific advancement than we did decades ago. Why is that? Well, in the 1990s, about 55% of NIH-funded research was based on entirely new ideas, concepts that were basically 0 to 1 year old. But check this out. Since the year 2000, funding for bleeding-edge ideas has completely collapsed. The NIH has started playing it incredibly safe, funding research that relies heavily on old, recycled concepts rather than taking a gamble on the unknown.
And to make matters worse, the current system is actively locking out the most innovative minds. The average age for a scientist to receive their first NIH grant has skyrocketed from the mid-30s back in 1980 to the mid-40s today. By delaying that vital funding until mid-career, the argument is that we're starving young, brilliant scientists of the resources they need at the exact moment they are most likely to propose wildly new and inventive ideas.
It actually reminds us of this famous, kind of dark warning from the theoretical physicist Max Planck. He said that a new scientific truth doesn't triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. Dr. Bhattacharya argues that this is exactly the dynamic the NIH has to actively fight against. Because if we just wait around for the old guard to age out, we are never going to get the urgent medical breakthroughs we need right now.
So what's the fix? Bhattacharya calls it the unified funding strategy. The core concept is that the NIH needs to start investing a lot more like Silicon Valley. In the tech world, investors back young people with incredibly risky ideas. Now, a lot of those ideas fail, sure, but they fail productively, teaching us something completely new along the way. By empowering grant reviewers to fund high-risk, high-reward projects at the bleeding edge of science, the NIH would build this dynamic portfolio. Yes, some projects will fail, but Bhattacharya argues that the ones that succeed could be the exact things that finally cure type 1 diabetes or prevent heart disease.
Let's head to Section 4, Funding Concentration.
Let's see how all of this builds into the third major structural problem, the geographic and institutional monopoly that is currently suffocating science. Right now, a staggering 1/3 of all NIH grant money is funneled into just about 20 elite institutions. Just think about that for a second. We have brilliant, highly capable scientists working all across the country, and yet the lion's share of the resources is being hoarded by a tiny fraction of universities. If a young researcher has a groundbreaking idea but happens to not work at one of these top 20 schools, their chances of securing funding are practically zero.
The reason for this massive monopoly really just boils down to basic economics, which we can call the trap. Under the current system, NIH grants link the direct money, which is the cash used for the actual research study, with the indirect money used to pay for the facility or the lab expenses. Because modern science requires incredibly expensive equipment, like massive electron microscopes, scientists are effectively tethered to these 20 elite institutions just to get access to the gear they need.
The proposed solution here is to totally sever that bureaucratic link between the research money and the facility money. By allowing facilities outside the top 20 to compete independently in a dynamic market, everything changes. Suddenly, the NIH can fund the absolute best scientists with the most promising ideas, completely regardless of their zip code. This strategy is specifically designed to supercharge scientific innovation in literally every corner of the country, not just in a handful of elite coastal hubs.
Finally, Section 5, the revolution.
Bringing all of these reforms together paints a really clear picture of the future. Dr. Bhattacharya's ultimate goal is to establish what he calls gold standard science. So what exactly does that look like? Well, it's science that is deeply humble and inherently replicable, always aiming for a much higher standard of truth. It's science that lives fiercely on the bleeding edge, taking those bold, necessary risks to find actual cures instead of just settling for incremental treatments. And it's science that is broadly distributed, enthusiastically supporting promising ideas and brilliant minds wherever they happen to be located across the country.
Which leaves us with a critical, final thought to ponder. We've seen a man who was literally cast out and suppressed by the scientific establishment return with a stated mission not to punish, but to radically overhaul the entire system through humility and innovation. If these sweeping reforms are actually implemented, if we truly manage to trigger this second scientific revolution, how many more lives could we save? What happens to the health, the vitality, and the longevity of everyday Americans if this vision becomes our reality? It's a totally fascinating prospect, and one we should definitely all be keeping a very close eye on. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.